I get so many messages and comments from you guys asking how to put together a budget gaming PC when you've got a really constricted budget, because this is something that isn't properly covered by some of the big YouTube channels. So in this 3-part series, we're going to be going through each and every step to go from idea to gaming. This video is part 1, and we'll be looking at how to pick out the right components to fit your budget. Today, we'll cover budgets from £200 all the way up to £500 and beyond. In the next video, I'll show you how to assemble your brand new PC, and then finally, in part 3, I'll walk you through how to get your PC configured with Windows 10 and all the right software. So stick around, get subscribed, and let's get cracking. Before we get too far into the video, make sure you stick around until the very end, because that's when I'll be sharing some of my super spicy extra top tips for configuring a budget gaming PC. Things that I couldn't fit into the main body of this video. But anyway, why don't we start with the parts you'll need to get started? I'm going to treat this as if you guys are complete new starters. So let's cover the components you'll require. On the screen now is a list of all of the components you'll need for a gaming PC. You can't build a gaming PC without these. So looking at a gaming PC that I built earlier, you'll need a CPU, CPU cooler, RAM, motherboard, power supply, and storage. Oh, and lastly, you'll need a graphics card. So with hundreds of options available to all of these, how do you know which ones to pick? Well, that brings us to the main chunk of this video. Which components should you pick? Well, this here is a gaming PC that more or less follows my guide for picking parts, so we'll be using this as our example system. Before we get too far, I just want to say that there is far too much information to cover in this video, so I'm going to encourage you all to leave your own tips and tricks in the comment section down below of this video, and also feel free to join the RMDTECH Discord to get my opinion as well as other members of the community's opinion on your PC builds before you go ahead and buy the parts. Step number 1 is to decide on your budget. So take out your wallet, count your pennies, and decide on a firm budget you want to stick to. Once you've got a final budget in mind, then you can start looking at which components you want to buy. The next step is to take your overall budget and split it up. We'll be allocating a budget for each individual component. On the screen now, you can see the 3 sensible examples I've created. This should give you a rough guide so that you know how much to spend on each component to try and get yourself a well-balanced system. You don't want to accidentally spend the majority of your budget on the hard drive and have none left for a graphics card. So now that you have a budget in mind, there are still so many options at those price points. What do you pick? Well, if you haven't already guessed, I am highly recommending you purchase used components rather than brand new, at least for the majority of the parts. You'll get much more FPS for your money that way. So your search for PC parts should start by looking on your country's used marketplace apps and websites such as eBay, Gumtree, Craigslist, and Facebook Marketplace. This brings us on to step number 2, deciding on the actual components themselves. The best part for you to start with is the CPU. Working out which CPU you want to go with is the most important part of the build, as it will determine and have an impact on all of your other components. Looking at the percentage figures I gave you guys earlier, we're going to be looking at spending roughly 12 to 16% of the overall budget on our CPU or processor. I'm going to start by suggesting something controversial, and that is that you guys should avoid AMD CPUs if you're on a budget. I have nothing against AMD CPUs. In fact, my main PC behind me is using one, but when comparing older generation Intel and AMD processors, Intel takes the win every single time. So unless you can fit a Ryzen class CPU into your budget, I'd recommend going Intel. But that still leaves a lot of options. So which should you pick? Well, assuming you've decided to buy a used Intel CPU, here are some rough guidelines to help you out. You should have a minimum of 4 cores. You should also not go older than a 2000 series chip. Those are some really basic guidelines, but they'll help you out a lot. Some good examples of CPUs that you could look into are the i7-3770K, the i5-4690, and the i5-6600K. You certainly don't have to go for one of these, but they are all good options at different price points. Our example build here has an i5-7400. It's a no-frills 4-core 4-thread CPU from Intel, but it performs reasonably well in modern titles and won't cause us any bottlenecks. If for whatever reason you're keen on going Team AMD instead, then the rules are simple. Do not, under any circumstances, pick an FX CPU for a gaming PC. If you're not sure how to tell, the CPU name will begin with the letters FX. These CPUs, despite their high core counts, have aged very poorly, so only consider one of these if you find it on a very good deal. Sometimes your CPU will come with a cooler, depending on the generosity of the seller, but if yours didn't, then you'll also need to pick up a CPU cooler. The easiest way to do this is to search for the CPU socket name and then for the word cooler. Find something compatible and then you're off to the races. If you're not sure what to pick though, I'd recommend just finding a stock Intel CPU cooler like this one, or grabbing a Hyper 212 Evo. If you're not overclocking, either of these will be perfect for you. Next up is the motherboard. You'll need to pick a motherboard which is compatible with the CPU you picked out in the previous step. The simplest way to do this is to find out which socket your CPU is. You can do this with a quick Google search. Simply search for your CPU name and take a look at the information on the manufacturer's website. Intel lists this as the socket on their website, whereas AMD lists this as the package. Intel sockets always begin with the prefix LGA, whereas AMD sockets begin with AM. Once you know what your socket type is, for instance, our example system uses LGA 1151, then you can begin searching for a motherboard. Start by searching for the name of your socket and the word motherboard on your favourite used parts marketplace. Once you have found a selection of motherboards within your price range, you should ensure they are fully compatible with your CPU. To do this, find the name of the motherboard from the listing. If you can't find it in the description, you might be able to read it directly from the photos, as it is usually printed onto the motherboard PCB. A simple Google search will bring you to the motherboard manufacturer's page, where there will always be a list of supported CPUs. Ensure your CPU is on here, and in our case it is, and then we can carry on. Another thing to note here is you should try to avoid picking out a green motherboard. And when I say a green motherboard, I mean physically the colour green. Now you don't need to do that if you consider yourself a bit more of an expert. However, if you're uncomfortable with this selection process and you're not confident, a green motherboard is most commonly found in OEM systems from Dell or HP and can often have certain issues which make compatibility a nightmare. So just for a little bit of peace of mind, it might be worth avoiding one that is mostly the colour green. It's really it's a pretty poor rule, but it's a nice sort of overview that, whilst might mean you miss out on a few good deals, does ensure a little bit of extra peace of mind. The next component that we'll be considering is RAM, random access memory. Our choice of RAM will be fairly simple. You should first work out whether your CPU and motherboard require DDR3 or DDR4 memory. This will be listed on both the CPU information page as well as the motherboard's information page. Your motherboard will only ever support DDR3 or DDR4, never both. Once you know if you need DDR3 or DDR4, try to find the largest capacity RAM within your budget. On older platforms like these, the speed of the RAM isn't so important. If your RAM budget is £30 or less, I'd usually recommend looking for two matching 4GB sticks of RAM. These will be sold in a pair for a total of 8GB. If your budget is higher than £30, you might be able to find two 8GB sticks in a matching pair for a total of 16GB. You don't need to get two sticks of RAM, but you should if you can, as this will allow you to boost your performance very slightly through a technology called dual channel RAM. Next up is storage, and to keep things simple, I'm going to recommend two easy configurations. On smaller storage budgets of less than £40, I would recommend a 120GB SSD and a 500GB hard drive. It is also advisable to get these parts brand new if possible. If your budget for storage is greater than £40, then you can start to look at getting a 240GB SSD and a 1TB hard drive. Links to my recommendations for these will be down in the video description below, so you can pick out the right ones. Now you have your core platform decided on, it's time to pick out a case. The most important thing to do here is to check that your motherboard is compatible. You can do this by looking on the manufacturer's page for the exact motherboard and finding out if it is ATX, MATX or ITX. Once you know this, you can begin looking for cases. ATX cases will support ATX motherboards as well as smaller motherboards such as MATX and ITX. So if you want to be on the safe side, you can pick out an ATX case that you like the aesthetics of. If you're a bit more space conscious, then look into going for an MATX case, but bear in mind that an ATX motherboard will not fit inside of an MATX case. That's because the M stands for micro. I've linked some recommendations for cheap budget MATX and ATX cases down below. We're nearing the end of our part picking adventure now. It's time to pick our most important part of the build. That's right, it's time to pick the graphics card. First up, remind yourself what your GPU budget is. In a budget build, it should work out at roughly 28 to 36% of your overall budget. But if you have already picked out your other parts and you do have a little bit of extra spending room, then this is the time to spend any extra pennies that you've saved on other components. Now with that said, don't forget that we still need to factor in roughly £40 for our power supply. Okay, so you know your GPU budget, that's great. Now I know I previously recommended staying away from AMD processors. Well, now I'm going to recommend trying to find an old AMD graphics card. AMD graphics cards have aged much better than Nvidia GPUs. This is partly helped by their tendency to have higher VRAM capacities in comparison to their Nvidia counterparts. I have a series looking at the best GPU at different budgets, so be sure to check out that playlist if you're stuck for ideas. I would suggest the R9 390 at the cheaper end of the spectrum. It's a much older card, but it beats out the GTX 970 for a similar price. Creeping up in budget, the RX 580 8GB is another fantastic option, though I usually would not recommend its 4GB little brother, as the price difference is so small it's worth paying the extra for the 8GB model. Now, despite what I've just said, our example system here has exactly that. It's an RX 580 4GB model. It was on too good of a deal to be able to avoid it because it came from an old cryptocurrency farm. For modern day gaming, I would recommend making sure that any GPU you purchase has a minimum of 4GB of VRAM for gaming in 2021. You would really start to struggle with anything less, so make sure you find something with either 4, 6 or 8GB. If you're unsure if the GPU you've picked out will be good enough, go on YouTube and search for the name of your CPU and the name of your GPU with the word benchmark. Chances are someone has made a benchmark video so you can see exactly what type of performance you can expect in the system you've designed. Finally, it's time to pick out our power supply. As a general rule, avoid anything that looks like this. If it's silver rather than black or white, avoid it. That's not a perfect rule, as there are some good power supplies that look like this, but it's an easy rule to start with if you're a beginner. I usually recommend beginners to go to sites such as Attribution.com. They have a great wattage calculator that will allow you to work out which PSU you should buy. Just input all of your components you've previously selected and it will work out what wattage power supply you should purchase. I usually like to add 100 watts onto this figure, so if you get suggested a 400 watt PSU, I tend to suggest bumping that up to 500 watts. That way you've got a little bit of space for future upgrades and a bit of breathing room for your power supply. Next, it's time to go online and see what you can find from a reputable retailer like EVGA, Corsair, Be Quiet or Seasonic. There are other good manufacturers out there, but those are some good options to get you started. Just be sure to check out reviews of whichever power supply you buy before you buy it. And that really is it. Congratulations, you've made it to the end and now you too know how to design and configure your own budget gaming PC. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss part 2 of this series where I show you how to build your PC. But if you've made it this far, it's probably because you wanted to hear my super secret top tips. So without further ado, here they are. Tip number 1. You can look for a processor, motherboard and RAM bundle on places like eBay. These are usually much cheaper than buying the parts individually and often guarantees compatibility because they would have come out of an old PC that's now being parted out. Tip number 2 is that you guys should go ahead and join my Discord. The link is down below and you can join the Discord to get one-on-one advice on your part choices from me and the rest of the RMDTECH community. We can help you guys out, pick out the right parts and suggest changes that you guys might need to make to get the best bang for your buck. Tip number 3. There is a website called PCPartPicker.com. You can use it to help manage your PC build and this will try to notify you of any incompatible part choices. And it will also help you find the cheapest retailers for the parts that you've selected. Though that said, PC Part Picker is usually better if you're going to be purchasing brand new parts rather than used parts. But it is worthwhile knowing about just in case you can make use of it. And that really is it. Congratulations, you've made it to the end and now you too know how to design and configure your own budget budget gaming PC. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss part 2 of this series where I show you how to build your PC.